Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I'm George and I'm your average bear. In today's video, we'll be talking a bit about badge painting. You've probably heard the term, maybe you know what it means, maybe you don't, but I applied those techniques to my very recent build of a Kitbashed 25 model unit of Deathwatch Space Marines. It was a daunting project. I learned some stuff, what to do, what not to do, and I hope the lessons that I've learned will help you in your next gargantuan build. If you have any takeaways from this video, it's don't paint 25 models at the same time. Just don't. Be nice to yourself. Avoid it. Let's see how it went. I recently finished this pretty large build of Kitbashed Deathwatch Kill Team members. And now that I have them built, I mean, there's still some temporary parts, things happening there, but they're pretty much built. The poses are basically finalized, and I've glued everything down that I can glue down without impacting subsequent painting. So now it's time to do the actual painting. But I've got 25 of these. How the heck am I going to do this in a reasonable amount of time? Well, batch painting. That's the trick. And there's a couple of different ways to do it. I'm not particularly expert at this. I haven't done a group this large ever. But I've done, 5 to 10 at a time. I think the principles are the same. So I'll go through it to see if I'm right. I might be completely wrong. And so there's basically a couple of steps that I'm going to take to undertake this to make it manageable, right? So there's still a bunch of pieces that aren't permanently glued, and if I try to prime these all at the same time, I'm going to mismatch pieces. Or I have to manage just a ton of different parts, painting them, etc., etc. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stage these for the next step. And staging them basically means I'm going to group them together in terms of similarities and things like that, a kind of difficulty level. So what I mean here is some of these will be pretty straightforward, like this guy. He's pretty straightforward. There's not a ton on him that I have to look out for that'll interfere with the gluing, with the painting, I'm sorry. In fact, his arms are, oh no, they're not glued down. This arm is glued down because it doesn't interfere with the armor. This one is not glued down, so I only have to keep track of the arm, the head, and the main body subassembly. So that's 3 subassemblies. So I'm going to pick troops kind of like that have a similar level of difficulty and kind of get them ready for priming, which is the first real step. But before I do priming, I have to stage them, and so that means breaking them apart, putting them on the little sticks I use, which I then will mount on my painting panel for priming. Once they're all primed, then I'll move over to basing, then washing, dry brushing, highlighting, etc., and any detailing that needs to happen. So it's relatively manageable. I'm going to stage them, like I said before. I'll show you this guy as a point of contrast. This guy's a lot more complicated. Very little of him is glued down. The backpack is loose, the arm is loose, both arms are loose, the head. So this one's going to involve more subassemblies. And I've got 4 of them, so I'll be able to tackle these in one group. The more things stay the same within the batch, the better off the end result, and the easier it'll be. So that's the first step. I'm going to stage them, and during the staging, if I notice anything that needs additional sanding or scraping, like for example here, there's still some flashing I need to get rid of. So while I'm staging them, I'll kind of do the maintenance on these that they require in order for them to be fully ready for painting. So I think the first step is I'm going to identify the kind of the special dudes. So sergeants, black shields, those guys, and I'll start the process off with them. So these 4 will be my first batch to paint, well, to prime. They look reasonably well scraped and sanded. There is a little bit of work I need to do on this guy's backpack. Oh no, never mind. Those dots are supposed to be there. Okay. Here are the boys. They're all primed up. And boy, it took forever to get these primed. Mostly the sheer amount of them, but pulling them apart, their temporary assembly, mounting them on their little pegs, and kind of repeating the process for 25 models. It took longer than I thought. Like, I knew it was going to be long, but oh boy, that was a lot. At any rate, they're done, they're dry, and I didn't do a great job with the prime. I was running low on the thing I had, and I'm hoping that this will still be okay. I've mostly got them covered, so we'll see. Hopefully the prime that's on them now will be sufficient. The other thing, as I move things around here, the other thing I'll point out that I've done a little differently than usual is I've used a skeleton bone colored primer. This is from the Army Painter line, and I usually prime my Space Marines, for the Deathwatch anyway. I prime them in either a white or a gray, occasionally black, although I'm kind of not feeling that as much these days. And so I've recently started building Imperial Guard units, Astra Militarum, and I really like the effect, the look that I get when I use bone white as the primer. I haven't done it for a ton of models, but for those that I have, I really like the way it looks. So I'm going to try it with these Space Marines to see if see what it looks like with a black glaze over it. I am hoping to get the highlights. I hope that they're going to be warmer than I usually get, and see if I like that better. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I'm hoping for good results. I've mixed some matte black with a little bit of water just to make sure it's nice and thin. Not quite a glaze, I don't think, but something thinner than normal, just out of the bottle. And I'm going to apply the glaze, as is my custom. Just apply it to all the pieces that are going to be black. Leave them off of any pieces that are not going to be black. And so this is a Deathwatch unit, or probably several Deathwatch units, so the main color, of course, is going to be black, but I'm going to embellish it with some interesting colors here and there. Red, silver. So anything that's going to be black or metallic, it's going to get this black glaze. Anything that's going to be red, usually just the weapons, the occasional helmet, helmetless heads, that sort of thing, that I will not base in the black. I'll base that in some other color. But to do the batch painting, you really want to do all one color first. So I've got 25 models worth of black glaze to apply. Now I'm thinking that this glaze is probably a little dark. I don't know that I want my blacks to be this black. So what I'm going to do is, before this dries up on this one model, I'm going to just add a little bit of water to the paint I already have on here to thin it down a bit, and then do something similar with the glaze that's on my wet palette. So it's just a dot, and I go over the glaze I've already added, just to kind of thin down what's there. This technique usually works to thin down what's on the model. There we go, that's better. Yeah, I don't know if you can tell, but I want a little bit of the primer, of the undercoat. I want a little bit of that to show up. Not a lot of it, but some of it, to give the blacks a bit of variety. Now, since I've glued quite a bit of this model together, specifically the arms to the torso, I have to be more careful than I usually am at applying the base glaze. I'm used to kind of slopping this all over the place, and it looks okay, but this was a conscious decision to do it this way, to make the whole thing faster, since I have so many models to get through, and I want to get them done kind of in the same 1 week period that I usually allot for projects that I'm filming like this. So to get through 25 different models, I have to take some liberties to make things go faster. So one of those liberties is limiting the color palette that I use. The other liberty, of course, is that I am painting as quickly as I can, and so focusing on one color at a time really helps with that. Also, my use of a glaze here is probably the most important part of the painting quickly kind of process, because you want to have a nice looking model, but you don't want to spend a ton of time, edge highlighting and adding shadows, yada yada yada. You want the glaze to do the work for you. Doesn't mean you're not going to add any details or do anything like that to make them better, but you want most of the work to be done as easily and quickly as possible. And so glazing here really helps that along. Another thing that helps matters here is, if you have things glued together, you have fewer parts to keep track of, and you only focus on those areas that are going to show up on the model. When you have things kind of set up so that you do the best possible job, you end up wanting to paint things that aren't going to show up on the model because you want to make sure that everything, that you do a good job painting, and so you'll end up spending time on parts that probably don't matter to the end project, just for the sake of doing the good job. So, approaching it this way, it forces you to let those details go and only spend your time on those things that will end up showing up at the end. As I'm applying the base coat to these guys, I was thinking that it would have been a lot easier to do to just base them in black, since the main color in this for this model is going to be black, because I'm spending quite a bit of time actually basing. I've spent probably about I want to say at an hour or so far, and I've got 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. I'm working on my 9th model right now after about an hour of painting. Well, and just basing, not actual painting. And so that's an hour that I could have spent not applying the base coat. And so if you really want to do it quickly, that's a way to go. But I'm not trying to do the quickest way. I'm trying to do a quick and cool looking way. So the models that you end up with will be visually interesting as opposed to, well, just painted, and so priming in a color that will kind of complement the basing. I think it's good compromise between time and end results, because you could do it quicker, but if you do it quickly, like base them in black, it's not going to look as good as if you just spent a bit more time applying a base coat, as long as it's a glaze, right? As long as you're doing, as long as some of your undercoat shows up. If you're just going to base them in straight, kind of a full strength acrylic paint, then this won't matter. But your end result, it won't be as visually interesting. At least I don't think. So take my opinion for however it's worth, or whatever it's worth. So it's a necessary step if you want to have decent looking models. This is not going to result in awesome looking models. I don't have the skill set to produce awesome looking models. I'm not a professional, and I don't expect I'll ever get to that level. But if your intent is to get good looking models with a minimal time investment, then I recommend that you take the extra time. I think it helps if you think about this method as painting with contrast paints, only not using contrast paints. You're using the normal paints, but you're just watering them down a bit to get the glazing effect that you get with contrast paints, but without using the, funky colors that I see with contrast paints. I don't know why. I don't like the way the colors look. This gets us, it gets me the colors that I want, with the bonus of you getting the glazing effect that you get with contrast paints. Best of both worlds is what I'm saying. I feel like I should elaborate just a little bit more on this approach and why I use it. So I spend more time on the basing step than other steps, because I think it has more bang for my buck in terms of what the final model looks like. So if you think about, like, let's say you can spend your time either basing the model, or you can spend the time getting those really fine details and adding a bunch of different colors, stuff like that. You know, you get the eyes just right, and every pouch is highlighted perfectly. What you get is, yeah, those details are nice to look at, but what are you looking at for the most part? You're looking at the armor. You're looking at the big swath of, in this case, black paint. But if you're not painting Deathwatch, maybe you're painting, you know, Ultramarines or whatever. And so you have these large areas where almost everything you see is the base coat. So for me, it makes sense to spend more time on the base coat, right? The parts of the model that you're going to see the most. And so if you spend your time there, then yeah, you could still spend additional time on the detailing. But if you're painting with this method, you're probably not like at that level where if you spend the time on details, they're not going to look as good, like say as a professional, right? Because there's people who really know their stuff and who do a really good job at this, and they make remarkable models, and they, you know, paint all these little details and what have you, and it looks amazing. But I don't have that skill set, and if you're watching this channel, you probably don't have that skill set either. So using the tools that we have available, in this case our skill set, to the maximum effect means we have to kind of tailor our approach. The first layer of base is done. So all the black bits on this huge group of kill team or veteran Space Marines, they're all based. So I've got the black glaze on them. So I wanted to show you what they look like before I move to the next step, because this took a while. Now, it wasn't necessarily just the basing, but it was also the assembly and disassembly of the models. So I would paint a small batch of, say, 4, or I'm sorry, I would base that small batch of 4, and then I would assemble them, disassemble the next batch of 4, paint them, reassemble them, etc., partially because I wanted to show you kind of step by step what it looks like, and I can't do that if it's just a huge mound of pieces. But also because, you know, I'm doing batch painting and I want to keep track of the pieces. I don't want to have to remember what sword goes to which model, so I'm reassembling them as part of my overall technique of making sure that I keep track of everything. So there's a lot of time wasted in disassembly and reassembly with each batch, but that's okay. That's okay. And I do want to point out that this might just be entirely me, but it feels like this black reads a little differently from my other Space Marine Deathwatch Marines, and I mean, that was the intent. It feels like this black is a little warmer than the other blacks that I've used, and that's exactly what I hoped for. Now, my impression could just be confirmation bias. In other words, I'm seeing what I expected to see, when in reality there is no difference. I won't really be able to tell until I compare these with the previous batch of kill teams that were primed in either black or white or gray. But it's academic. The important thing is that, to me, this looks a little better, and whether that difference is real or imagined, I'm going to go with it's real for now until I have evidence to the contrary. I really like the way they look. It's a nice warm and somehow a little more matte. The black is a little less reflective. It's warmer and somehow it's also darker to me, and that just might be the contrast with the existing skeleton bone primer. I don't know. Whatever the case may be, I really like the way these are shaping up so far. So, my next step is to put down the next largest base glaze. And that's going to be, I think, the red that I use for the weapons. For Firstborn Marines, I use pure red, which is right here, as opposed to dragon red, which is here. This is what I use for my Primaris. I kind of alternate them, kind of between the cloth and the armor bits, but generally speaking, when I use a red for Firstborn Marines, I use the pure red, and Primaris get the dragon red. It's not a hard and fast rule. But I think that that's the next kind of biggest batch of color to lay down, so I'm going to start with these three and painting any parts that are going to be red. Another thing that I should probably mention is that, so I glued a lot of these down, not all of them, but enough of them that I should point this out. I ended up removing the most of the glued down parts. I wanted a bit more freedom than I had. So when you're building this, keep that in mind. I tried to help my, kind of reduce the workload associated with batch painting by gluing as many of these as I could. It didn't work out. So there's that. And for all of these, I left the right knee pad just with primer, because that's going to be red. Now, I generally avoid using too many colored elements, or like different colors on at least Space Marines, although I think it's true for a lot of my models. I try to use a lot of different colors because I find it that looks cartoony to me. If if I go with a red kneecap and then like another colored kneecap and then some other stuff over here, the large number of painted parts that are not kind of the base layer, I don't know, it feels like it cheapens the end result. So I try to go with kind of understated details. Well, in this case, it's a red base, but this will probably be the only red part on the armor that isn't a weapon. There might be some details later on, like maybe that skull that's in the chest plate. Maybe that'll be red. For sure, the eyes will have some red on them. But for the most part, I have very, very few painted parts. I don't know. To me, it looks nice. You might not like the idea, so your mileage may vary, as it should, because those are your models, and you do what you want with them. So far, I'm liking what I'm seeing with this red. I think it looks very bright, it's very vibrant over this skeleton bone prime coat. So obviously I won't know for sure what it looks like until the very end when I start adding some washes, but so far I'm digging it. I like the way it's looking. So I've got 22 more of these to go. You don't want to see all that, do you? Nah, I didn't think so. I've got most of the basing done. And I say most because there's quite a few areas that need base coats, but that I'm going to leave kind of towards closer to the end. So none of the chapter-specific pauldrons have their base coats, and that's because I have to go and decide what color these are all going to be. And so I'm going to leave that to closer to the end. Same thing with like these dudes without helmets. I have to, add their face color. And so those two things will require kind of special colors. So there's going to be a variety of colors for the shoulder pads. There's going to be a variety of colors for the faces. There's not a ton of models with exposed faces. There's 3. No, there's not 3. There's 5. So these guys don't have helmets, and so they'll have face colorings. I try to have a variety of face skin colors with my models. I don't know how important it is to have my pretend soldiers be inclusive, but I find them more visually interesting if they're not all the same generic face color. So I typically do kind of a variation of the same color. I'll start with a lighter color, then I'll darken it up for a couple of them. Oh, look, there's another one. Okay, so it's 6. 6 don't have helmets. All right. Anyway, but I do that a little later. Since there's relatively few models where that's a thing, I'm basically just going and doing all the major basing. So basing that covers large surface area. But before I get into that, there are 2 models that are kind of special and require kind of a large surface area for basing, and that's my black shields. So for these guys, I haven't done the capes, and that's because it's just 2 dudes. And I haven't decided what color cape I want to use. Here I could probably do a red, maybe a different shade of red than we have here, but just kind of the lore behind these dudes kind of suggests that I don't do something bright. Maybe I do something darker. So I'm thinking either like a dark purple, or maybe I'll do just a gray. I don't know. And for these guys, I haven't done their backpacks. I could have done that, but since they're not glued down, since I have to paint the cape first, I haven't done that. I did decide on a color for their pauldron, so the black shields have a special pauldron. I'm going to go with kind of like a leather look for those, and just to give them a splash of color that was consistent with other things. So you'll notice I've already done the leather pouches. For any models that had a leather pouch, I went ahead and kind of leathered them up. They're not at the finished stage, obviously. They're just kind of at the beginning. It's the base coat. So I'm going to decide on a color for these cloth elements. I don't know. I'm leaning towards gray. Yeah, I think gray is going to be it. Alright, here are my black shield capes. And I'm going to start off, before I add the glaze, I'm going to start off with a little bit of dark tone. It's a bit of a wash. I want to lay this down on some of these crevices before the glaze happens, just to kick up the visual interest. And I don't know how well this is going to work, but I'm hoping it'll do better than my usual attempts at providing some kind of shadow. My last attempt hasn't gone well. I haven't published that video yet because I'm still figuring it out. So I'm thinking that if I add the wash now before the glaze, when the glaze does finally get on there, it won't look as I don't know, there's kind of a roughness to it, and so I want to avoid that in this model. I'm hoping this will do the trick. I have since watched a video by, I think it's Midwinter Minis. I think that's the name of the channel, or no, it's the Mini Witch, I think is her handle. And so she describes a technique that I think will work. I was missing something, and she described it in such a way that I think I'm going to be able to pull it off. But I'm going to need some practice, and so since I have 25 models, this isn't where I'm going to do the practice. I'll do the practice elsewhere. Once I get decent at it, I'll, show it more prominently in my videos, assuming that I'm able to find some success with it. So for now, I'm going to try kind of cheating. So trying to give the appearance of a blend without actually doing any blending. I think this should work, but who knows? I've been unsuccessful plenty of times before. So notice I'm just adding that to those creases where there should be additional shadows. I'm doing inside and outside. I don't know that I'll do the cowl, the hood that the black shield is wearing. I'll take a closer look at it to see if this would be a good candidate for this sort of attempt. I suspect it's not, because it's on top. That's where all the light is going to be hitting it. So even the shadows there will be, there'll be plenty of light hitting it. But I'll check and see. I had to give the both sides of the cape 2 coats of the Necromancer Cloak gray paint, and now I'm going to hit the underside, the back part, with a bit of the dark tone wash. I want the inside of the cape to be darker than the outside, and I think this will represent my intent pretty well. So kind of looks like that. The back, I'm going to do something interesting to that, but I'm going to wait till this dries. I'm done with the capes on these black shields, so I thought I'd show you what they look like. I added a wash of lighter gray to the backside of the cape, just to contrast it from the kind of the inside of the cape. The inside has a black wash, the outside has a gray, lighter gray wash, just to kind of show that there's more light hitting this back thing. Now, if I really wanted to do a good job, what I should have done is go over this with a dry brush with that lighter gray, as opposed to the gray wash. The gray wash kind of settles on the nooks and crannies, which is the opposite of what I wanted. Okay, let me rephrase that. It's the opposite of what it should be, but it is what I wanted, in that I wanted something easy. So there's that. I might still go with a little dry brush here on the outside once everything is said and done, but I'm not there yet. So at least that's done. Everything is kind of glued together where I think it's going to go. So that's settled. And while that was drying, I went in and kind of touched up some pieces. There was a little, there was a few parts that were not quite painted. In fact, I didn't hit them all, as it turns out. So for instance, you see that little bone white colored piece there on the sword that needs to be painted. There's a little bit on the thumb there that needs to be painted with a base color. So I didn't do a complete job, so I missed some details, but I'll get there. I just wanted to get most of that done, and this guy's still missing his Deathwatch Pauldron, so I'll have to add that and base it and all that kind of good stuff. So I did the kind of touching up on all of the models that I have, just to kind of minimize the detail work that happens later. Certainly when I'm closer to being done with it, I'll, in the detailing phase, I'll go through each model kind of individually and make sure that I have everything that needs to be painted is painted. But I just really wanted to prep this for the next stage, which is to do some washing. So there's a couple of washes I'm going to use. There's the dark wash on the black armor, just kind of deep in the shadows. There's a kind of a brown wash that I'm going to use on like these models specifically, so the models with brown on them, but also I'm going to hit the pouches for any models that have these leather elements, and on these models with guns or any weapons that are red, I'm going to hit them with a red wash. So that's the next step. It should go fairly quickly. I do have a lot of models, but washing tends to be a pretty quick process. And I should point out that I didn't necessarily intend for this model to have this pose, but I kind of like it. He's kind of angling the shotgun kind of over and above, an enemy model. I think that looks really cool. I didn't intend for it to happen, but it's a happy little accident, and I will take every happy little accident I can get. Before I finish adding the dark tone to the base coat for all these models, I've done a couple, and I want to show you the difference because it's subtle and maybe it's not enough bang for your buck. I'm going to continue doing it. It's subtle, but it's there enough that I find value in doing it. Now, it's going to take an awful lot of this stuff, the dark tone. I'm going through quite a bit of it. There's a lot of models, and I'm using kind of a liberal application, but this guy right here, this guy has the dark tone wash over it, and this guy does not. They look fairly similar, but you'll notice how this guy is just a little darker, but he still has a lot of the highlights. The shadows are a little more contrasty. It's, not a lot. So you could maybe skip this step if you wanted to. I don't know. For my tastes, I like the way it looks. And maybe it's just that when you add the wash, it gives it a sheen that at the end of the day won't stay there, right? Because we're going to varnish it, and the varnish it cuts down the sheen. So I don't know for a fact that this step, the wash of the dark tone over the black armor, is really worth your while. I think it might be, but it's one of those things where you're going to have to make that judgment call for yourself. But I wanted to show you what it looks like so that when you make that call, you're making an informed decision. All right, here's the crew with the basing washed. So I've applied the wash to the black armor, which is a primary base. I've also applied the wash to the red weapons and other little details like that. And also for those models with leather components, like this guy right there, and this guy right here, I added a little bit of strong tone, which is this guy. I've added that to kind of, make it, give it some depth. And so I applied that to all these leather components, like these little pouches, straps if they've got them, that sort of thing. So this group of 25 is looking pretty decent. It's taken me a while. It's not like I'm painting for hours non-stop, because I have to do a lot of drying, and this is kind of a repetitive process. So I'm drawing it out over time, which is not great for my YouTube schedule, but it keeps me sane. I think the next step for these guys to add a little more life to them is to start adding some of the detailing. So I'll start off with my primary metal color, which is going to be it's going to be this guy right here, gunmetal. It's the primary metal color that I use for my Deathwatch army. And I'm trying to keep it so that the metal components are only silver. I don't like mixing gold and silver on the same model, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to avoid that. So there's a lot of details. I'll give you this example right here. The shotgun. I can do silver on the red, but it won't look as good as gold on the red. And Deathwatch models are, they're kind of more elite than your typical Space Marine, so they would need some gold. But I don't want to use gold everywhere there's metal. So I'm thinking, the teeth of these chain swords, or the compensator or muzzle or barrel, whatever you want to call these for the weapons. I don't want to make those gold as well. So I'm gonna have to use 2 different colors, but I'll use a gold sparingly. Starting with this guy, I think the first of the metallic details I'm going to work on is the Deathwatch Pauldron. And for this, I've set up a little dry palette. I do most of my painting on a wet palette. I'm not really good enough a painter to use all the benefits that a dry palette, that a wet palette can bring. Like, I don't do a lot of paint blending and mixing. So I usually do most of my painting with the aid of one of those. But for dry brushing, I have found that a dry palette is what you really need. They're not very expensive. You can use a plate, one of your cookie plates or whatever you might have, and so you just dab a glob of paint on there and put your brush in there, clean it off most of the way on just a paper towel or whatever you have handy, and then you dry brush, and you end up with a very nice effect. And it doesn't work as well if you take the silver paint or the metallic paint from a wet palette. It becomes a little harder to control, and it ends up not doing as good a job. So I highly recommend having a dry palette on hand when you're going to do dry brushing. Now, the other thing that I've learned about dry brushing, at least for me, I'm not saying that everyone's going to have a similar experience, but for me, I was having trouble getting the effect that I wanted. I was having trouble with the paint kind of going into the cracks, and so even when I dried my brushes really well, and I realized, obviously, the dry palette makes a huge difference, but also the brush selection makes a huge difference. And so I've tried a couple of different brushes, and I've settled, at least for now, on this guy. This guy. This is my rattiest brush I have. I used to use it mostly for applying the base coats to my models, but I didn't really know how to take care of my brushes all that much. This was the first brush I ever used, and I've kind of abused it. I've been painting Warhammer 40k models now for getting close to a year, and I've been on the fence about tossing this brush out because, it's dead. It's stiff as a board. And the bristles are kind of everywhere. It doesn't really hold a shape other than just that one that it has. I've used it to apply PVA glue. I've used it to apply texture paste to my bases. I've abused the crap out of this brush. It's been ready to be tossed out for a while now, except that if it kept it on hand, because I've used it for adding some additional texture to my texture paints, and so I've kept it for that purpose. But I kind of in desperation, as I struggled with with dry brushing, I thought, well, let me try this guy. It's beat up, but the bristles are really stiff. I wonder if that'll help my dry brushing. And it has. It is the best dry brush that I own. And I know at some point it's going to die. And I don't know what I'm going to do when it does. But it does a fantastic job with dry brushing. I used to use a cosmetics brush because that seems to be what all the fancy boys and girls on YouTube use for dry brushing. I just didn't get the results I wanted with it. The bristles were too soft. I like hard bristled brush for this effect. So there it is, folks. You never know when you're gonna have use for those old brushes that you think really just you need to get rid of. Maybe don't. Maybe use them around. They might have a use later. Since I'm so happy with the way these dry brushed pauldrons came out, I think I'm going to try something similar here with the Aquila that's on the chest of most of these Marines, but in gold, since I typically go with a gold pattern or a gold color for the Aquila, and there's some other details too. I'm going to try dry brushing that Aquila, as opposed to just doing like a layer coat. I want to see if I like the results, and oh my, I think I do. Yeah, look at that. I usually go with a metallic gold layer paint, and then I add a wash over it, but I think that looks better. And I'm going to do the same thing with these little details on the arm. Not all of these Space Marines have that detail, but some of them do. This detail comes from the Deathwatch kit. They have this kind of elbow detail. So I'm going to try that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go hog wild with this. I'm going to do the hilt on these power swords the same way. So not a lot, just some of these details. I want to spice them up like this. I mean, so that one, maybe the details are a bit more shallow than I was hoping for, so the dry brush was a lot less targeted. But the hilt, that looks pretty cool. I think I'll keep that. So I'll add that detail kind of wherever I find it. I'm still working on getting some of the details on here, and I've got quite a bit of it. I'm not all the way done. There's still quite a few things missing, like you can see here. The kind of the pommel, or not the pommel, I don't know what that's called, the end of the sword, the purity seals. So there's quite a few bits left to do, but it was time to start gluing the model together. And I wanted to point this out because it's not necessarily obvious, but when you're kind of painting the way I have been doing it these past few episodes, I paint the models and then I assemble them. And one of the things that happens is that when there's paint on the models, your plastic cement is not necessarily going to work. And in cases like this, you probably have to resort to super glue, which is not my preferred method, but it'll work if I need it to. So just so you're aware, if you're kind of doing this batch painting like this, where you're not assembling until you finish most of the painting, then make sure you have some super glue with you, because you're going to need it, most likely. Unless there's something I'm doing wrong, which is always possible. But keep that in mind. I am making some progress. Now, I am still miles away from finished. But I'm at that stage where, you're detailing stuff, most of the major work is done, and the models are, pretty close to done. But, detailing a model takes a little bit. Detailing 25 models takes, 25 times as long. I've done a couple of things with this stage that I hadn't done before that I want to point out because I thought it looks kind of cool. So, this piece I may have done before. So you'll notice the lightning claws. So all the power weapons are this shade of blue, and they're not just straight up a shade of blue. This one probably gives you a better idea of what I did, and I'll explain how I did it. So you'll notice how this blue, it isn't straight blue, right? There's something interesting happening there. So the first thing I should point out, so I put on a little bit of blue. I think it was this guy right here, this crystal blue. It's a very bright blue. I use this shade of color for almost all of my power weapons. But rather than just, add it to the swords and stuff like that. So in this case, the sword is based in skeleton bone. And you can see some of that beigey off-white color showing through. And that's because the blue that I used a shade of it. So it's a shade of blue. And it was very nice. It had some coverage, but allowed some of the base to show up in the finished product. Once that dried, I went back over it with some blue tone, which is this stuff. It allowed the blue that is at the end of that to deepen up a bit, but it didn't deepen evenly. It deepened in certain spots. So it tends to collect either in recesses or in kind of the middle of parts. So it leaves the edges of these things almost uncovered, and you can kind of see them here on these lightning claws. So you'll see this happening a number of times. I thought it was a really cool effect. It's a nice way of showing, hey, look, these are power swords, right? These aren't just like a metal sword. There's some kind of something, some kind of power surge happening inside it. And I'm having trouble focusing my camera because there's a lot of stuff happening in the background. And so, yeah, it gives, I don't know, it gives it kind of like an electric sheen or an electric effect without me having to freehand stuff or apply a bunch of different techniques that I'm not really comfortable with. So it kind of cheats its way into an interesting effect without spending a ton of time on it. So I was really happy with the way that turns out. Yeah, I could have done better, but for the amount of time I spent on each of them individually, yeah, I'm not going to ask for more. I did the very same thing. I don't have a lot of plasma weapons, but here I have a combi plasma. And so it's the same kind of deal with that. There's a plasma pistol up here somewhere. So this guy has a plasma pistol. So that's kind of how that went down. The other piece that I was experimenting with it, and I really like the way it showed up, is one of my sergeants is carrying a Xenophase Blade. Oh, here he is. So he deserves kind of a mention. So the Xenophase Blade, I did something a little different. You'll notice how the blade is essentially, it's black, right? So, but there's two kind of surfaces to the blade. There's a black surface, and then there's that cutting edge. The cutting edge, I added a layer paint. It's just your standard gunmetal. But once that dried, I went over that with a blue tone, and it gives it this really interesting sheen. It kind of I don't know. It kind of looks like the blue power weapon effect, but it's different. And for the Xenophase Blade, I kind of want to do some other interesting things to it, but I just really liked the way that looked. I'm pretty pleased with it. Obviously, like almost every model has little bits and pieces that aren't finished. Like you'll notice the bandoliers are on his chest. The leather effect is there, but the rounds that are on that bandolier, they're not done. There's plenty of stuff like that. I've got the faces done for the most part. You'll notice there, I mixed three shades and progressively darker shades, and so I don't have a ton of dudes with bare faces, but it was preparing 3 shades allowed me to have some variability. Then I slapped some face wash right over that, or flesh wash, I'm sorry, not face wash, but flesh wash, right over that, and it gives me a decent face. Yeah, I could go in and do some highlighting and adding some shadows, but there's 25 dudes. Now, I'm going for quick and easy. The other thing I did that was, I thought, pretty interesting was a lot of the metallics I brushed on, or I dry brushed. So it's a technique I used often with the Pauldron, right? The Deathwatch Pauldron. But I did it to a bunch of other surfaces. So you'll notice the Aquila on the chest, the belt buckle, the pommel on the swords. Whenever there was a metal effect, for the most part, not always. Like, for example, this is an exception. This is that Deathwatch bolter. The scope, it's straight up metal. It's not dry brushed. But for the most part, any metal looking component, including stuff like this on the backpack, little details like that, I dry brush that metal on there. So sometimes it's gold, sometimes it's the gunmetal, whatever the case may be. I dry brushed it on there, and I think it looks pretty cool. It's a little uneven. There's a couple of them that a couple of models are missing it. But, they're coming together. I'm pretty excited. Mostly I'm excited to be done. I've made a bunch of progress on these guys. Specifically, I've painted all the Pauldrons, and so there was quite a healthy mix of chapters. There were only a couple of repeats, like these two guys, these 2 white scars. And so I've been trying to do a decent job with the Pauldrons, and there's the splash of color that these have. But I will say I've discovered, or I've realized, something that wasn't obvious when I was doing these 5 at a time, or possibly 10 at a time, is that the chapter-specific Pauldrons, they're a ton of work, and some of them are a lot more work than others. So I'll draw your attention to these white scars. The 3 colors, yellow, which wasn't as bad as I was expecting. There's the white, and there's a red trim, so already that's pretty complicated. But I also have to do that little outline on that box that's close to the lightning bolt. And that is a pain because it's super, super tiny. So you have to be very careful with this because it's super easy to get a red paint where you don't want it. So I'm going to use a little bit of overbrushing on this and hope that I keep a steady hand. But my reflection as I do these, at some point, there's a good chance I'm going to start a second Space Marine army. And one of the things to consider is how difficult they are to paint. It's not just the cool color of the armor, but it's the icon. How complicated is it to paint? The white scars, they're a cool chapter, like their aesthetic, but holy cow, these Pauldrons are just no thanks. So I can imagine trying to do this, 50, 60 times, get tired of it real quick. So it's going to be a no to white scars. I'm going to go with something easy. Like at one point I was thinking, ooh, salamanders would be cool. But those two have a slightly more complicated pauldron. So maybe not. Are there any like blank marines to choose from? Maybe. Ugh. Okay. Yeah. See, doesn't look great, but I can continue messing with it, cleaning it up. I'll get it looking halfway decent. I'm getting closer to the end. And one of the things that I picked up on was that my weapons were just super dull. They're so boring. So I got to do something. There's a lot of little buttons, there's a lot of little details that I can go in there and paint. And also I should probably do some edge highlighting, maybe with some dry brush, get some nice black edges on there. However, as you are probably already aware, because you've heard me complain about it, there's 25 models. So there's between 25 and 50, somewhere in that neighborhood, weapons to do that to. So that's not going to happen. Thankfully, I've got cheat juice. Look here. Just get a little dark tone, dab it on everywhere where there's some details that I want to show up, like little slides and little crevices, and I get a pretty decent looking gun. Alright, so there it is. There's a combat shotgun. That took maybe 10 seconds, as opposed to the, a few minutes had I done this any other way. Now, could it look better? Absolutely. Do I have time to make 25 models look better? Absolutely not. So, that is a level of detail that all my dudes are getting. And this works, it works better in some places than in others, but everywhere I add this, it just kicks it up a notch. If it's between this and not doing anything additional to your weapons, then just do this. If you've got the time and the skill, sure, knock yourself out. Edge highlight and detail 25 weapons. Who am I to tell you how to live your life? But for me and mine, washing is the way to go. The washing does an especially nice job with these bolter weapons, the Deathwatch bolter guns. So, take a look at that right there. And then take a look at this. Just got to be careful not to hit that purity seal, because I don't want to redo that. That took me a little bit of time and effort. There's that weapon. You can't tell me that was 10 seconds that wasn't worth spending. Yeah, it's going to lighten up when it dries, but it's going to look pretty decent anyway. I am finally at the very end of this build, this ginormous build and paint project. I am so ready to be done with it, and it's time to mount these guys permanently to their bases. And I've prepared a number of bases, well, not a number, 25 bases. And I featured them in a different video on how to work with air drying clay to create your bases. Anyway, if you're interested in how I did these, feel free to kind of watch that video. It should be on my channel. And so here just kind of gives you a look at what I've done. These are pretty quick, except for the fact that there's 25 of them. And they actually look better than they have any right to look, given my lack of skill. If you do watch that old video, you notice that at the very end, I showed myself getting rid of some, so I made 3 different types. The third type, I just hated the way they looked, and I replaced them with these. These are not made, handmade from clay. These are bought. I bought these are resin bases. I just primed them, gave them a base coat, gave them a wash, gave them a dry brush, and then slapped in a tuft of grass to make them look presentable, and they look pretty decent. So I've got the 25 best bases I made this week. They're going to go into this project. I've also done something else, something a little different with some of these models. Some of these models are sporting a little bedazzling here at the very bottom of some of the halves of their special weapons. So, like this Thunder Hammer, I think this. Here we go. This Sergeant, bottom of the chainsword. So yeah, some of these weapons had a slot on them where I decided I just needed to spend the extra couple of minutes to bedazzle the pommels to make it look like there's a big old jewel at the end of the sword. I think it looks kind of neat, and it didn't take very much time, and the little gems aren't that expensive. So, give it a shot if you're looking to spruce up your models, if you want to make them look a little different from everyone else's. And if you want to see the how-to, check out that previous video as well. But this video is coming to a close. I hope it's not too long. I'll try to make it manageable in the editing process. But it's time to mount our dudes onto these bases. And I'm just going to mount them randomly onto the bases. So I've got 3 different types of bases. And a random dude's going to go on a random base. Now, this is not the way you would ordinarily base your models. Your models typically won't be based at random. But these are, and I have a really good reason for that. And that reason is that this is a unit of 25. Well, let me rephrase that. This is a project with 25 models. There is no such thing as as a Deathwatch unit that's that large. So these were always going to be based differently. These are at the very least 3 different squads, but they're probably up to 5 different squads. And realistically, I can combine these with some of my existing Deathwatch units, and I have, 7, 8 5-man squads. Who knows? The point is, these were never meant to be deployed as a single entity. These were always going to be deployed kind of as on a mix and match style. So what bases I use doesn't really matter all that much, as long as they have kind of a common, I don't know, maybe not even a common theme. Just get them based, that's all I'm saying. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on how to position your models on bases. There's kind of a school of thought that says, make sure that they're centered, that makes sure that there's no pieces, no parts of the model that are kind of off center or what have you, and that's a valid approach. That is a valid approach. It's not an approach that I adopt. I tend to go with kind of a more, a more deliberate. Anyway, I position the models on the base in a way that makes them look best, even if they're not centered. In fact, I kind of avoid centering, kind of like you would avoid centering a picture, like a photograph you take. You know, in photography, there's the whole rule of thirds, so it's not really a rule, but it sort of is. The idea is that you're not, the subject of your image isn't necessarily dead center. That's kind of the approach I'm taking here. So I'm artfully, quote unquote artfully, positioning these so that they look as cool as possible. And also making sure I understand where the attachment points are going to be. And some models are just not gonna, they're not gonna glue well to certain bases, and so you kind of mix and match until you find a position that will work for that particular model. Oh my gosh, they're finally done. I am so happy to be done. I am so happy that I'm not going to do one of these things again for a long, long time. And I'm so happy that they kind of turned out pretty nicely. No, they're not pro level, not by any stretch, but they're pretty good. They're pretty decent for tabletop standard. I've got 25. It's a mix of ranged and hand-to-hand. And honestly, I have more ranged than I expected. More than half of these models have a ranged component, and the rest of them are kind of hand-to-hand. So here's a couple of takeaways if you're attempting something at this scale. Point number one, don't. Point number two, seriously, don't. Painting 25 models at a time is too big an undertaking. I mean, it's not like you're building your own house, right? They're just models, you can put them away, but it slows you down. It slows you down quite a bit. And it's not in the places where you might think, right? So, human motivation is a weird little thing, and it varies from person to person. For me, when I started this project, it was zipping along, right? Like the building was fine, and I started, I did the priming. That was pretty quick. Although that took longer than usual because I don't typically use a blow dryer to dry my paints. I let them just air dry normally, and so I'll prime a batch. Let them dry long enough for me to unload them from the paddle, and then I'll load up a new batch, prime those. And so there's a lot of gaps between steps. Right? You could prime all your models in a matter of an hour if you wanted to do it the most efficient way. But that's just not how I was geared up to do my stuff. I have a small hobby area and whatever, a ton of excuses. The point is that everything goes slower than you think. So once everything was primed, I did the basing, and that went relatively quickly, but it still took me a couple of days to get everything done with incorporating all the drawing and kind of handling and adding and removing of parts, since everything was temporary until I got to the end. Same thing with the washing. It went pretty quick in terms of the entire step for 25 models, but there was a lot of things in between: drying, assembling, or disassembling. Where it really got into a snag was the detailing. So once the priming, basing, and washing was done, it was time to start adding the details that bring your models to life. And we're talking about the purity seals, we're talking about the weapons, we're talking about the little cabling, the pommels, all that kind of stuff. And holy cow, it takes forever. And then, since these particular models are Deathwatch, doing the Pauldrons it's a tall order too, because depending on how you arrange it, there's a really good chance you have, you know, something like, well, maybe not 25 different chapters represented, but you have something like 20 different chapters. Each has its own color scheme. Each has its own, detailing on the icon. Yada yada yada. It takes a long time. And then there was the basing. The basing took a long time too. So when it all was said and done, it took me like 2 weeks to do this. Now, I say that, and I should remind you, I am not a professional YouTube dude. I have an actual job that pays me, and so I do this on my spare time. And so this is probably closer to how you're doing your hobby than a dude who can sit down for 24 hours and paint up a huge army, 2,000 points or whatever. That's awesome. That's not where I live, and that's probably not where you live. Your experience will probably be a lot more similar to mine than it would be to the professional YouTubers. So if you attempt this, you're going to be doing this for for weeks. And while that's fine, on a per model basis, you're getting a lot of, hobby time, a lot of enjoyment. It's hard to do the same thing for your hobby for that extended period of time. I found myself wanting to do other stuff rather than finish the stuff that was already here. Honestly, the reason I kept pushing through was because I've got, I've got a YouTube channel. This eventually has to get posted, so there's that. And part two, 25 models leaves a ton of mess in your hobby space. I didn't want to pack them up because as soon as I pack them up, we're done. So, long story short, so long story, slightly less long. It was a fun experience, but it was a chore. If I was doing this again, I would get to the assembly, pick out 5, maybe pick out 10, and store the rest for later. Work on those 10, finish those, and then, a month or 2 from now, go back to my pile of remaining Deathwatch Kill Team dudes, bring out another 5, bring out another 10, and work on those. I thought having them done in a big chunk would be a little less painful than it actually was. So there it is, guys. That's my experience. It's certainly going to add numbers to my Deathwatch army, and I'm glad I did it. But more than anything else, I'm glad it's over, and I cannot wait to try a different model. Hoo-wee! Guys, I hope you learned something from me in this video. If you did, leave a like and a subscribe. I truly would appreciate it. If you didn't, well, sorry. Maybe tell me what I did wrong or what you'd like to see done differently, or not, whatever. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.